is being recorded and will be shared with TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. John Severino, who completed his doctoral dissertation in 2023 at University of Arizona Global Campus. He has been in private business for over 30 years and is currently the Chief Operating Officer of a mortgage bank in Southern California. John is also the Chief Executive Officer and coach for myadultadhdcoach.com. When not working with clients, he can be found hiking in the backcountry or behind a set of drums. And with that, I will turn it over to you, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So today we're talking about ADHD and workplace accommodations, which was the subject of my dissertation. And in thinking about how this fit into the teaching and learning conference mission this year, I really got to thinking about how even achieving a doctorate with ADHD can be quite the feat, and actually taking the steps to get through it on a day-to-day basis all the way through. As I was mentioning earlier, I have the unique opportunity of having gone to Ashford University and then University of the Rockies. And then I ended up at UAGC, of course, for completion. And it's been a great ride and journey working through this. So I wasn't exactly sure how to fit it into the mission in the beginning when I saw the mission statement. This is my bio information for anybody who might want it, but basically we just heard it. So in discussing how to fit my dissertation information into the TLC conference, one of the things that we thought about was, well, why? Why did I pursue this particular subject? And kind of how did I get to this moment? And quite simply, when I have a picture here of me graduating from University of the Rockies when I received my master's in psychology with an emphasis in life coaching. And that was in the health and wellness track. So my dissertation fits in very well with health and wellness. And we'll talk about theory in just a moment. But the reason I even pursued my doctorate, which I was pretty firmly set against. I finished my undergrad at Ashford and then did my master's at University of the Rockies. And I thought at that point I would be done with my academic career, as it were. And when I went to the graduation, not only did they graduate the master's people receiving their masters, but they also graduated the new doctors. And when they did that, with each new doctor, they also put up on the screen the title of their dissertation and like maybe a quick 2-sentence reference on what it was about. And while I was sitting there receiving my master's, it dawned on me that I had a story that I wanted to tell, and that understanding what I did about ADHD was going to lend itself well into a research project. And so I decided at graduation to go ahead and apply for and pursue my doctorate at the time University of the Rockies, which became University of Arizona Global Campus. So that's why we felt, I believe, that this conversation fits in, but that's also a testimony, if you will, to a different style of education that, for me, with a person with ADHD, this method of education works very well. And that's kind of the point, right? Is how do we accommodate our lives if we have disorder that we need to deal with? Many of us are very familiar with the ADA and ADA amendments that support accommodations for physically challenged people. And we know that there's been a push for health and wellness as a department, if you will, certainly a culture in the business world. And one of the things that we understand will help with health and wellness in the business world, of course, is understanding of different disorders and understanding the need to adhere to the laws that exist. And part of that is even understanding that they exist. And that's where my dissertation led us. So in this slide, we'll sit here for just a minute. We want to pick up on a couple of ideas. I think likely everybody has heard of ADHD at this point now, as in the last few years, the topic has become quite the hullabaloo, if you will. And some of that goes along with research that's been done. Historically, ADHD was thought of as child's play, if you will, in that there was a great understanding that there was a set of children through history have existed. Since 1753, there's been at least notice of a different set of actions that could be prescribed as being different than the control or the normal group. Now we would say neuronormative as opposed to neurodiverse. So ADHD is definitely in the neurodiverse category. Traditionally, ADHD is thought of to be a complex that starts in childhood and involves hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. That's the triangle of ADHD symptoms. We understand how those issues, like inattention, can affect somebody at school. And much research has been done into youth, children, especially in the school domain, that have ADHD and struggle with some of the issues that are involved with ADHD. Less research has been done into adults with ADHD. The first time that ADHD into adulthood has been even accepted, if you will, or made part of the norm when discussions with ADHD occur is when the DSM-5 was released. And in the DSM-5, the ADHD symptoms were also changed to include adult ADHD as existing, if you will. We've known for a while that most people who have ADHD or exhibit ADHD symptoms as children don't actually grow out of it. It just manifests differently. In my dissertation, in the literature review, I have a very long discussion, if you will, about how the manifestation of ADHD in adults will appear different. One of the things we can think about is hyperactivity. When we think of ADHD and we think of hyperactivity, we often think of fidgeting, jumping around, energizer bunny type person without a lot of control over their physical actions. And that is, of course, part of ADHD. But an interesting part of ADHD is that as we mature, we learn to control those activities since they're frowned upon in the social environment, especially in a work environment. If you're not in a job that, like say a firefighter or a policeman, which a lot of ADHD people prefer those very stimulating adrenaline rush type of jobs because they take care of the hyperactivity component and the stimulation component. However, for those of us who've had to work in offices for most of our lives, we also learn to modify our behavior, if you will. And so the hyperactivity becomes internalized. So the brain doesn't stop. You'll often hear people who have ADHD describe staying focused or how our brains work, basically as a radio station that's on scan. But when you hit the scan button, it doesn't stop scanning, it just continues to scan. And so, and it'll hone in on the strongest signal, just like a scanner on a radio. It's going to jump to the highest signal. And that's a great way of understanding kind of how the ADHD brain can work. In studying adult ADHD, one of the things that we have come to understand is, although the components of ADHD, the triangular symptoms are well known, as we see it manifest in adults, we also start to see the effects of managing those symptoms and the effects of managing those symptoms over a lifetime without treatment. And another thing that's occurring right now is that many adults are actually being diagnosed as adults. So it's thought that the ADHD, the amount of ADHD, if you will, in the population is about 5% of the total population. It's thought that about 1% of the population who has ADHD are actually treating it. The rest are in knowledge mode. But we also know that ADHD is very heritable. And so what happens is, as children are diagnosed, practitioners are now immediately looking to the immediate family to see if, not even really if, but which parent is likely to be carrying the ADHD. We don't want to say gene per se, but which a parent has ADHD, if not both of them, that passed it on to the child. And so that's led to more adult diagnosis. And as we've started to study adult ADHD, we understand that the life outcome of people with ADHD is very negatively affected. We have a shorter lifespan. We're much more likely to be addicted. The jails are disproportionately filled with people who have ADHD symptoms. And so we understand that those are the outward signs, but also inwardly, we know from interview and from research that adults with ADHD who manage over a lifetime tend to have a lower quality of life. They might find themselves seeking out many different types of jobs, becoming bored, if you will, at jobs, which is just a lack of stimulation, but it's part of the symptoms of ADHD. What we also know about looking at ADHD in the workplace, or people who have ADHD and their actions in the workplace, we also know that companies, and this is included in my literature review, that many companies suffer financially from not necessarily dealing with people with ADHD because maybe they're unaware, or maybe the person with the ADHD is unaware. But like I said, job changes, so retention is an issue. And of course, another issue is how somebody with ADHD will work in the workplace or work environment, what work that they'll choose to do and also not do, definitely affects the workplace. Many more days off as far as illnesses, skip days, etc. So companies lose in that way as well. The biggest cost, though, becomes employee retention and training for a company. So as I was doing my literature review and trying to determine what would be a great thing to study, a study to do that would really give us more information about ADHD, I found that there was almost no information for HR departments, companies who want to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which all mental illnesses are part of the ADA and ADAA information, right? So in order to comply, what a company has to do is a company has to allow for reasonable accommodations. There's almost no guidance legally on what reasonable means. But what we do know from the ADA and from cases that are contained within the research of my dissertation, you can look up the cases where people with ADHD have actually won major lawsuits for being with companies that did not or were unwilling to accommodate. What we do know is for accommodations to be reasonable, the company needs to be able to create that accommodation, if you will. Also, though, it's an interactive process. The employee actually needs to be involved in helping to understand what accommodations might be needed. But beyond that, there was very little written about what accommodations work. How do HR departments even go about this? So I did a modified Delphi study where I took a group of professionals, in this case, a group of professional HR, 8 human resource specialists. Among them, they have one of them had over 40,000 employees, and one had as few as 20 employees. And so you can get that range. That's a huge range of HR specialists I was working with. In a Delphi study, the study is done using an iterative process with questionnaires, where you're funneling down to a consensus of the group. And we found consensus within the group about the numbers of accommodations. For instance, all the group agreed that that in order for a company to be able to accommodate somebody with ADHD, that whatever accommodations they decide, the reality is that those accommodations will have to be visited again, and that we'll have to check in and see if there's been any improvement. And we might have to change accommodations 2 or 3 times is what we found. We found that the most effective way to make sure that accommodations are working is to do continued reviews and monitoring on the person with ADHD. So the idea of I can't focus, and it's because there's too much noise and I want a quiet office, might be how an employee might ask for an accommodation. The company might be willing to give the accommodation of a quiet office. Now that employee is given that accommodation with a quiet office. And then we check in. If we don't check in for a year or 6 months, it's very hard to know whether or not that accommodation is actually working. It seems like, well, that's what they asked for. And it makes sense if you can't focus, that being in a quiet space will help you to focus. If that's actually counterintuitive to the actual treatment protocols for people with ADHD. And I think that they might find when they check in with that particular employee that they might not be performing as well in a quiet office, because in fact, maybe they needed something a little different than just quietness, because oftentimes people with ADHD in a completely quiet space go crazy. So maybe the actual accommodation was headphones with white noise as opposed to a quiet office, because the white noise will discourage the interruption from the other conversations. And at the same time, it'll eliminate that complete silence that leaves your brain to just, in a scattered way, stay on scan all day. So that's just an example of the types of things that were discussed both in literature review and in some of the questionnaires with the HR people, with a great understanding that in the end, if you don't comply with the ADAA, that in fact you could be sued, you could lose a lot of money. And so we also have found that there is a developing desire for a health and wellness culture in most companies now. And so, especially if the companies are large enough to have to comply with ADAA, then also they generally these days are wanting to evoke a health and wellness culture. And so being open to accommodations, especially for people with invisible mental disorders like ADHD, is a great opportunity for them to invest in that culture. We did discuss specific accommodations in the dissertation. We don't have the time here to review them all, but we also came to consensus, or the group, I didn't come to consensus with the group, but the group came to consensus on the idea that yes, you must involve the employee when it comes to accommodating and understanding what accommodations might help. But they also, as a group, found consensus that they wanted to involve the doctor, right? Or a professional, doesn't have to be a doctor. I do work as an ADHD coach. A coach who specializes in ADHD is certainly qualified to help assist a company in understanding the accommodations for that client. Also, research that is available. The one website that everybody pointed to is the JAN, Jobs Accommodation Network, the Jobs Accommodation Network online. That's hosted by a division of the government called SOAR, and they have many lists of accommodations depending on the disorder. They're just suggestions, but it is there's some research available on the JAN website supporting the accommodations that are discussed. And so one, as an HR professional, could go to JAN and get that information available for them. As I said, I did a Delphi study, which is a process for all doctoral students. Read the different study types, get a really good understanding of how they work and how you work, so that you're comfortable with your dissertation study format. So,
I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure that you had enough time to answer questions. You probably can't see the chat. There are a lot of there's a lot of interest in your presentation. So I didn't know, we have about 5 minutes left. If you wanted to kind of bring it to a close, I can share.
Absolutely. So let's look at the chat.
Yeah.
The last slide was just the outcome, which we basically discussed. Half hour is a quick format, so
Yeah. Yeah, but there's a couple of really good questions that I thought it would be great to have you comment on.
okay.
One,
Why don't you pick those out and we'll make that comment.
okay, so one from Bonita is what strategies or accommodations develop
I'm sorry. I'm
work
sorry,
to
Sherry.
support
You cut in and out.
ADHD and maintain focus. Can you hear me?
You cut out halfway through.
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you now.
So wants to know what strategies or accommodations developed during online education can be transferred to the workplace to support employees with ADHD.
Perfect. So, what made the we seek stimulation. It's not that we become bored necessarily, but the way our hormones work with our neuroreceptors, there's a great desire all the time to fill the empty dopaminergic system, if you will. So that's why we tend to jump around from subject to subject, but we also, when we get into a new subject, get very involved. So for school, what happened was being in an opportunity to take one class for 6 or 9 weeks, very focused, constant activity, and then you're done. As opposed to the 20 weeks with a midterm and a final, that system did not work for me, but the very short, great attention span involved classes did. So if we take that to the workplace and we look at projects, multitasking is a great thing to be able to do. However, what will help somebody with ADHD is to be very focused on quick outcomes that are measurable, and then with a good firm end date of the project. And you don't have to use the conclusion of a huge project necessarily, but you do need to have it parsed out so that that section that person is working on is completed at a very specific time. It's very succinct, and that will help a lot in the workplace. And that's mimicking the school experience that I had in this school system.
Okay, and we have about 2 minutes, and Debbie asked, are accommodations only granted if the employee furnishes documentation of the diagnosis by a neuropsychologist, et cetera?
Okay, so that is completely and 100% up to the company. So in order for ADA protections to kick in, the employee does need to ask for the accommodations, which means they need to they need to let the HR department or a company know on their own that they actually have the disorder and that they're seeking accommodations. Most companies, if they're going to accommodate, are going to ask that there is an official diagnosis, that you're not just reading your newest self-help book and walking in and saying, I have ADHD and I want accommodations, right? So I have found that many companies will absolutely ask for an official diagnosis. It doesn't have to be a neurosurgeon. ADHD can be diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a psychologist as long as they're following the protocols within the DSM-5. There's no specific test. ADHD is clinically diagnosed through interviews.
Well, thank you so much. This is so interesting. There's a lot going on in the chat, so you've definitely hit on something, John. So thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for your participation in today's session. I did put a link in the chat. It's to a survey to nominate TLC presentations for conference awards later today, and share your feedback on your conference experience. Thanks, everyone.